Western civilization has had a pretty good time. It's kickstarted the greatest technological revolution ever and conquered the vast majority of the world. The West was so successful that everyone in the world tried to imitate it. Why and how did this happen? What even is Western civilization and its defining features? This video is part of a series I plan on making looking at the structures and macro histories of each of the main world civilizations. I'm starting here with Western civilization, but I hope to go into Islamic, Confucian, Mesoamerican, or classical civilization, seeing how they rose and fell and their strengths and weaknesses. With that out of the way, let's start. A pivotal part of Western civilization's history were the Normans, who conquered England, Sicily, and parts of the Levant. There were some absolutely incredible figures in Norman history between William the Conqueror, Robert Guiscard, and Tancred d'Hauteville. I was in fact just watching a pretty interesting documentary of the Normans. I love the Middle Ages and it's my favorite era of history, and so it's always fun to watch more stuff about it. I was able to watch this on Magellan TV, a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers that has the richest history content of any streaming service. It's got great content ranging from the Middle Ages to the ancient and modern worlds, alongside cool biography, geopolitics, and practically any other material. Magellan's compatible with basically any device and has 4K with no additional cost. Magellan's also having a special offer of a 1-month free subscription for What If Altist fans. With all this going on, what's stopping you from clicking the link in the description, watching Magellan, and learning about whatever inspires you today? I'm going to start here with a controversial claim. The Greeks and Romans weren't a part of Western civilization. I understand this is somewhat arguable and the definitions are pretty blurred. As an American of British descent who speaks a Germanic language, uses a Germanic law code, wears tartan on a regular basis, and worships an interpretation of Christianity invented in 17th century Britain, I know I'm coming at this from a very different perspective of a Frenchman or Italian whose religion, language, and legal code are all derivations of the Roman. However, my historical speciality is the era around the fall of Rome, and I can tell you that a massive palpable shift took place in the 2 or so centuries on either side of 400 AD. Let me explain what these changes were, and in doing so, I'll demonstrate really how different the Romans were from the modern West. Also, if we're being perfectly fair here, I'm splitting classical civilization off so I can make a future video about it. This also brings up the question over whether Latin America and Orthodox Eastern Europe, like Russia, are parts of Western civilization. I'm not going to answer that question here, but I do think those civilizations are distinct enough that they warrant their own videos explaining them. The West, as I'm describing it here, is the part of Europe that was part of medieval Catholicism, alongside the English and French-speaking parts of North America and Anglo-Oceania. I'll also throw in parts of South Africa if it suits me. Western civilization's got 3 big influencing parts: Germanic, Roman, and Christian. Some parts have Slavic and Celtic, and in America's case, African influence, but every part of Western civilization has some varying degree of Germanic, Roman, or Christian influence. Looking at how these 3 forces combine to form the modern West is a fascinating story. The story starts with the fall of Rome. Much to most people's surprise, by the time we get to the end of the empire, the western segment had basically degenerated into a parasitic clusterfuck that was actively hurting the inhabitants involved. The Western Empire was an authoritarian aristocratic command economy with some of the worst inequality of any era in history. The Roman Empire in the year 380 was the closest thing you'll get to the Imperium of mankind in Warhammer 40k. The sources of political power and economy were also completely non-functioning, with the Empire incapable of raising armies of its own 30 million people and instead hiring barbarians. These barbarians ended up taking over political power once they realized how rotten the internal organization really was. When the Empire fell, the health and quality of life for the average peasant in Western Europe actually improved. Once the central government stopped working, 3 sources of social power filled the vacuum and gradually formed a single elite that became Western civilization. The influence of the Germanic barbarians varied a lot depending on region. In some areas like England or the Rhineland, they depopulated much of the native population and became the majority culture. However, in most of Western Europe, there weren't enough of the barbarians to really have a huge effect. For a comparison, something like 200,000 Anglo-Saxons probably migrated to England, a country whose population was knocked back to somewhere over 500,000 due to plague, while only 30,000 Visigoths went to Spain, a region with a population of 5 million. It's no surprise that England became a practical extension of Scandinavia, losing Christianity and the Latin alphabet while Spain remained practically Latin. What occurred in the more heavily populated parts of Western Europe like Spain, France, and Italy was that the barbarians quickly intermarried with the pre-existing ruling elite. Taxes were so bad in the late Roman Empire that wealthy Romans actively immigrated to the countryside and became lords on massive estates where the tax collectors couldn't get them. In this part of the Roman Empire, before the empire fell, there hadn't been a major non-civil war for 400 years, meaning the Roman elite were heavily pacified. The Germanic barbarians became a warrior elite while the native elite often went into the church. Under most circumstances, these elites generally became the same thing over time. The dominant power of these ex-Roman kingdoms was the Frankish Empire, or the only one that actively pursued a policy of working with the Catholic Church and the native aristocracy. This is also considering that the Frankish Empire at its inception was the weakest of the major barbarian kingdoms. The Church was the sole functioning international literate organization in the West. It was also the only fully meritocratic organization, so the smartest people went into the Church. This meant that money and talent flooded into the Church, making it the most important cultural organization in Western Europe and the glue holding the broader society together. The shifts that created modern Western civilization occurred in this era. Starting with the Germanic barbarians, the West got a warlike ruling class. In most of the world's civilizations, like the Arab world, Hindus, and China, the ruling class were respectively merchants, priests, and bureaucrats. This actually did the West a remarkable amount of good. What occurred in those other Asian civilizations was that since the native ruling classes couldn't fight, bloodthirsty nomadic tribes that could seized power, who horrifically repressed the civilizations and led them to decay. One of the great mysteries of Western civilization's history is that the peasantries had never become pacified. In the Asian civilizations in the Roman Empire, the central provinces of the empire became useless fighters while the armies were recruited from barbarians on the edges of the frontier. This never occurred in the West, with the English, Germans, and French remaining crack military fighters while never having to recruit, let's say, the Scots and Swiss to fight for them. This allowed the core Western nations to keep expanding while most of the other great empires would have resulted in stagnation. I've heard lots of possibilities for this, and I honestly don't know which of the options in front of you is the accurate one. The other main contribution the Germans gave Western civilization was the obsession with legal rights and the origin of democracy. We generally have the idea that modern Western democracy came from the Greeks and the Romans, but this really wasn't the case. By the time the Roman Empire fell, it was an authoritarian, theocratic mess with no democracy at all. However, the Germanic tribes had the belief that every member of the warband had Freiheit, or freedoms conferred on him as a man. These included legal freedoms and the right to elect the next king and leader of the warband. These rights stayed with the nobility who jealously guarded them throughout the Middle Ages. Something we often forget is that medieval Europe wasn't absolute kings ruling on a whim. Practically every kingdom in medieval Europe had a parliament. It was with the invention of gunpowder and cannons that could knock down the nobility's castles that kings gained power over the nobilities and created absolute monarchies. The two states that didn't do this and in which the parliaments won out, Britain and the Netherlands, followed eventually by the United States, were so successful that people started to imitate them. The idea that Western democracy comes from the Greeks and Romans is a post-ad hoc thing, where these Enlightenment philosophers were trying to justify their democracies. It admired the Greeks and Romans and so drew the connection that wasn't there. A part of Germanic culture that became very important was their obsession with legal rights. Germanic moots or things, their terms for parliaments, had very complex representative systems for different social classes. As we'll see, this system was reinforced by the West's later history and evolved into personal and property rights, and this is a big reason why the Germanic countries are so wealthy now. The Catholic Church at the same time was doing what amounted to massive social engineering. One of the biggest things the Catholic Church accomplished in this era was the creation of the individual. For most of history, people lived inside clans. This makes sense. In a scary world, not having family to protect and support you is terrifying, and in a competitive world, the bigger the family, the better. Also, fun fact, we're genetically predisposed to breed with our third cousins since that's the perfect balance between breeding with someone similar to us so our genes are more likely to survive, and different enough so that kids won't have deformities. Thus, the vast majority of marriages in history have been between certain degrees of cousins. Also, so that wealth and influence could stay inside the clan. For this reason, I'm founding a dating app with some friends matching up people who are between 3rd and 10th cousins. However, the Catholic Church banned cousin marriage, and this quickly resulted in the destruction of clans, as with each generation, people left the clan. With the clan gone, the nuclear family became the center of life and the individual the most important component of society. This sense of individualism resulted in the West taking a very different moral framework from the rest of the world. In a lot of cultural psychology, it's a general truism that there's the world, and then the West is a freakish aberration. Of the West, America is normally the most aberrant, and Japan and Indonesia are normally the exact opposite of America on most metrics. The West became a guilt-based culture in which one's sense of morality was a personally driven practical relationship with God, or one's personal sense of morality. In the West, one was a bad person for not personally living up to moral standards, like not having enough faith, not doing the right thing when alone, etc. The Western God is always watching you. The other Eurasian civilizations as a rule are generally shame-based, or you try to uphold the community's values. Thus, losing face is a horrific thing in China, since you're letting your whole clan down. In Afghanistan or Pakistan, honor killings, in which a male family member kills a girl for transgressing against some social norm, makes sense since killing her brings honor back to the family. In East Asia, your internal beliefs really don't matter that much. Following the proper Confucian rituals in public does. This sense of individualism also resulted in the West abolishing slavery very early inside Europe, being the only major civilization besides Zoroastrian Persia and Confucian China to do so. The Catholic Church abolished slavery, often working with local kings in the 11th century. Western Christianity has always been deeply uncomfortable with slavery, even though it has done some really horrific slavery in its time. However, when you compare it to a place like Islam, for example, who practiced the largest slave trade in history until the early 20th century, when the West forced them to end it, and still in real terms practices it in a lot of areas, and Christianity and Islam theologically aren't that different. Christianity is in a lot of ways a woman's religion. A big reason it became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire was that it appealed to women. Similarly, Western Christendom was the only major Eurasian civilization to not treat women horrifically starting in the early Middle Ages. In Islam, Hindu, and Chinese civilization, upper-class women were kept in seclusion from society and given practically no legal rights. Horrific stuff like foot binding occurred in China, while genital mutilation did in northeastern Africa, and widow burning in India. In Latin Europe, meanwhile, women could own property, rule kingdoms, become religious leaders, and important writers. Another important shift was that the Catholic Church banned polygamy, which again was acceptable in the other major Eurasian civilizations, as well as divorce. Both of these raised the value of upper-class women who had a monopoly on the family's reproductive success. Polygamy is also a perfect correlation with violence. Remember, for every girl that becomes a rich guy's fourth bride, there's more sexually frustrated young males who will commit more crimes and start a revolution. To be honest, polygamy wasn't widespread enough in the other Eurasian civilizations, normally being confined to the very upper classes, to have these sort of delirious effects. For that sort of thing, you have to turn to places like Bantu Africa and some Native American tribes. The main survivor of the barbarian kingdoms was the Frankish Empire. However, the Frankish Empire had no bureaucratic structure, and so once it stopped having god-tier kings like Charlemagne, it collapsed. This opened up the West to attacks from all sides, namely Hungarians, Vikings, Muslims, and Slavs. The West faced several centuries of these deprivations and generally became the anvil from which a powerful offensive West was formed. To start with, the Muslim control of the Mediterranean from around 700 to 1000 was important because it split the Mediterranean into three. If the Muslim conquest never happened, you might have seen the center of the West remain around Italy and the Mediterranean. North Africa was very rich, and if the Muslim conquest never happened, it could have become a powerful center of Western society. Instead, Muslim pirates forced the center of Western civilization to move to the area around France, southern England, northern Italy, and the Rhineland. Similarly, it also cut the West off from the Eastern Roman Empire, thus accentuating the difference between Orthodox and Western civilization. The nations of the modern West formed to fight off these outside invaders. Spain and Portugal were frontier nations against the Muslims. France, England, and Scotland all formed on the frontier to fight against the Vikings. Germany formed to fight off the Hungarian attacks, and the parts of Germany that turned out to be important were those in the Hungarian frontier or Austria, and the Slavic or Prussia. The pressure resulted in the West forming feudalism and knights. Since the central authority was so weak and the raiders were normally so fast, people turned to local leadership. These knights caged the peasantry and turned them into serfs under most circumstances. Each knight would build his own castle, which further accentuated the weakening of the central power system. However, and we often forget this today, feudalism was extremely effective. It protected the peasants and allowed economic and population growth, and the knights were the most effective warriors in the world, barring nomadic tribes like the Mongols. This allowed Western civilization to expand to a massive degree. In the years between 1000 and 1300, Western knight feudalism conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, the Balkans, the Levantine coast, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Interestingly enough, the nations of Eastern Europe generally formed as the frontier against the expansion of knight feudalism, as Poland, the Scandinavian countries, Czechia, and the Baltics were formed either by German colonization or resisting German colonization. Another very important factor is that the merchants in Northern Europe were originally pirates who gradually shifted to peaceful trading. This is really big because the importance of capitalism in Western civilization stems from it. Western merchants were well armed and could demand concessions from the governments they traded with, which couldn't occur in any other part of the world. Before 1000 AD, there really weren't plows that could farm Northern Europe effectively. However, a heavier plow developed that could turn Northern Europe into the most productive farmland of the western parts of Eurasia. This, combined with a warmer climate and technological influence from the Middle East and Byzantium, allowed massive population growth in the West to rise from a Dark Age backwater that it was in 1000 to practically the equal of any of the other Eurasian civilizations by 1250. In general, the West is very interesting in that it started at a very low and downright barbaric position around 1000 AD, but has faced what amounts to staggering, nearly continued growth for the 1000 years after that. This isn't the case for most civilizations, who have a golden age, then stagnate for a couple centuries, then barbarians kill a lot of people and the cycle restarts. Why is that? The West's success was so ridiculously massive that it really begs the question of how. This has been one of those questions where there's lots of popular answers, but none of the popular ones are really good in my opinion. You've got the guns, germs, and steel thesis about Eurasia having a higher concentration of certain kinds of plants and animals and being a horizontal continent rather than a vertical one. However, this theory doesn't explain why the West was so much more successful than places like India, Islam, or China, all of which have the same geographic situation. A big issue with the geographic determinist argument, or that geography dictates everything, is that there were eras in history in which places like the Middle East, India, or China were super advanced, while Europe was a backwater, and both areas still have the exact same geography. Similarly, the argument that Europe got rich by exploiting its colonial empires is laughable. First of all, Western Europe, before it started colonizing, was already the richest area in the world in GDP per capita. Similarly, once Europe gave up its colonial empires, it had massive economic surges, while the former colonies mostly saw declines in standard of living. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but you really can't find a correlation that you can run between economic success and colonialism. Massive colonial empires like Spain, Portugal, the Ottomans, and Mughals were generally poorer than the smaller, better developed states with no colonial empire, like the Germanys and Scandinavia. This theory, however, has got a fanatical fan base who use it to base their entire worldview, and they're very difficult to change their mind about it, so I'm not going to get bogged down in this argument. The answer I've come to is far less sexy. It's that Europe's social and political structure allowed competitivity, which forced Western society to continually compete to become better. On a political basis, this is pretty easy to see and generally a well-accepted theory. Europe never united into big empires like the Ming, Ottomans, or Mughals, and instead had warring states like France, Austria, Spain, etc. This endless military competition forced an arms race that resulted in massive technological and social progress. We can all see how the military competition resulted in technological progress, but social progress was also equally important. A good example of this can be found in the Indian Ocean, where the Portuguese were the first people to arrive, but they were legendarily corrupt, with the viceroy often living like a king, while the sailors starved in the boats. Meanwhile, the Dutch replaced them, and the Dutch worked terribly with the native population, however, and were very widely hated, and so they in turn were replaced by the British, who were the best empire of the three by far. In most of the world, however, the Portuguese would never face that competition. The second major thing that allowed the West to be so successful was a divided social structure. In the other Eurasian civilizations, a single social class controlled the whole society. In China, that was the bureaucrats, in India, the priests, and in Islam, an alliance of priests and warriors. That meant that the main flaw of that social group was able to manifest across the whole society broadly. The Indian priests and Chinese bureaucrats distrusted the military and so were continually crushed by nomadic tribes, while the Islamic warriors and priests basically made a deal to crush science and capitalism. We sort of have a myth that the kings of medieval Europe could rule like despots with having their will be law. This isn't entirely true. Medieval Europe had a really divided power structure, with the church, towns, nobility, and kings all trying to gain power from the others. This meant that a strong balance of power took place that kept all of these groups in check in turn. Rule of law is really important since it prevents social superiors from just stealing their lessers' work. In a place like 18th century Guatemala, you wouldn't work hard because it would just get stolen by your landlord. In a place like 18th century New Jersey, that would never happen. This became really critical for industrialization since you need to have large investment to build something big like a factory. The West between 1000 and World War I is really particular in that it was the only era ever in which money was more powerful than authority. In most of history, authority was really what mattered. If the Chinese emperor could order you to do something without pay, or inflate the currency to buy something silly, he could do it, and it would only catch up with him in his dynasty after a couple generations. However, for most of Western history, the market was more powerful than the state. When Spain tried to do what I described above, their currency tanked, as did their trade, which collapsed against international gold. The states that did successfully in the West were those that played with the market rather than against it. This was very liberating in that society became less structured around authority and class and more around ability across Western history. Another really big reason the West was successful was that in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church came to the conclusion that in order to find God, one should study the outside world, since God made the world, and so by looking at it, one can understand God. This very easily led to modern science. However, when we look at the other main civilizations, they considered reading ancient texts above looking at the empirical outside world. In Islam, that was the Quran; in China, Confucius; the classical world, Plato and Aristotle, etc. These all resulted in logical rabbit holes without actually doing anything real while the West was studying the real world. The effects of colonialism are really big and complicated around the world, but from the West's perspective, the big conquests of areas like Asia and Africa didn't really have big effects on the West itself. The big effects on the West itself due to colonialism were mostly in the New World. There were two big effects, the first of which was the introduction of New World crops that allowed industrialization. The only way the massive German and British factory cities could survive was because of the introduction of the potato from the Peruvian Andes. Similarly, the huddled masses of Leeds and Liège were fed from the fields of Argentina and Kansas. However, the bigger effect and the thing that ended up being decisive to Western civilization was the colonization of temperate North America, or the US and southern Canada. This allowed the West to more than double its land size and expand its population by more than 50%. Oceania is the other area that was introduced to the West, but its combined population is less than 40 million, which means it remains demographically insignificant. The European settlement of North America was one of the weirdest events in history, and the native population died at a 90% rate due to disease, and then a totally different population showed up bred like rabbits and spread across the whole continent from the Appalachians to the Pacific in less than a century without really changing its social structure. The big shift that resulted from the peopling of America was to shift the internal balance in Western civilization away from the continent to the British civilization. For most of Western history, Britain was a developed country, but it was a shrimp. In 1600, it had a population of 4 million, while Greater Germany and France each had 20 million. Now, English speakers are by far the largest Western group, with a population pushing up against 400 million, more than twice the next largest European group, the Russians, and far ahead of the next more strictly defined Western group, the Germans. Civilizations always get unified by a continental, highly militaristic, often pseudo-fascist bureaucratic state. Groups like Macedon, the Assyrians, the Qin, Tsarist Russia, and the Inca, etc. By those standards, Prussian Germany, or secondarily Russia, should have unified the West during the World Wars, and that nearly happened, but America was there. Britain's value system of democracy, liberalism, capitalism, etc. makes sense for a small mercantile island nation, but for a continental nation, you need to have a strong military at all costs or you get conquered. What happened with America was that it faced so little military competition from the Native Americans that it was able to expand across North America while maintaining a British social structure with British freedoms. America was able to get all the benefits of a wealthy island nation at the scale of a continent. America became so huge and wealthy that it had no competition inside the West and became the dominant power. I guess a good comparison would be, what if Carthage colonized Brazil, used all the people it settled there to beat the Romans and conquer the Mediterranean, spreading their weird system of democracy and capitalism? The American Empire is a weird one, with a weird confederacy over Europe that's really an empire, but no one involved wants to admit it, held together by not really functioning legal identities like the World Bank and EU, all of which honestly makes sense given the West's history. The US is almost a reluctant superpower, which is honestly a decently common thing across history, and half-asses a lot of its empiring, alternating between blowing up opponents and forgetting they exist. In total, a strange empire. The future of the American Imperial West is complicated and a topic I'll cover at some point in the future. For a couple hundred years, it was very difficult to find any real weakness in the West. The West was so dominant in practically any field, whether military, agricultural, medical, government, science, etc. However, after World War I, the West started to show its own weaknesses, and like Aristotle said, one's greatest strength when pushed to its extreme becomes one's greatest weakness. Before the World Wars, the West believed in its own racial, moral, religious, and civilizational superiority. This allowed the massive amounts of wealth and power the West had to be tolerable, even exciting. However, after the Holocaust, trenches, Charles Darwin, and seeing the Japanese and Russians beat Westerners, these became impossible to believe in. Without a God to forgive them, the guilt became intolerable. The West's guilt-based individualist system that had taken them so far had finally become a liability. The heart of the issue is that without the Christian bedrock that's existed for all of Western history, there isn't a moral structure that can justify doing anything, and so the act of doing anything is viewed negatively by the envious. Without the idea of the afterlife, communism becomes a way to redress inequalities in the real world, the irony being that those inequalities have to exist or everyone will be a lot poorer. Romanticism is a way of dealing with the lack of meaning given to us by enjoying life, but romanticism easily collapses into emotionality and depression when you have to face that most of life for most people is depressing and boring. Similarly, modern neoliberalism is about making people richer as fast as possible, but pushing for more money as fast as possible without any other criteria is a great way to fuck up your society really fast. One of the strangest things at the British-American world order is that it's one of the few empires that cares about morality. I can't imagine the Assyrians, Prussians, or Mughals really caring if their conquered peoples practiced slavery, and killing villagers was just a nasty thing you had to do to prevent rebellions and keep the empire running. The Americans, meanwhile, killed 500,000 of their own people in a civil war for the express purpose of ending slavery in their own country, while the British campaigned to end slavery across the world after abolishing it themselves. This doesn't even include stuff like trying to expand personal freedoms among the subjects of their empires, and trying to respect war rights and not kill civilians, stuff only the Anglo-American order and countries neighboring it have tried to do. The West has done absolutely awful things in its history, but it's also the only society that's felt guilty about it and tried to change. Interestingly enough, however, its own worst critics are its own citizens. Many citizens of the West hate everything the West does. The modern West is basically the only society ever that institutionally flagellates itself. Western governments fund artists that want to tear down those governments. Young people imitate criminals to show off their masculinity. The system that trains people to be in the leadership, the universities, trains them to also be disloyal to their own societies. From the perspective of any other society or any other era in history, this is absolutely bizarre. Without the shared belief structure that came from Christianity, there's no shared positions that anyone can agree on. This means that anything big like waging wars, figuring out an economic policy, figuring out what should go in education, just doesn't work because no one can agree on a shared value system. The West has been wealthy enough for the last 80 years that it's basically just been able to ignore these deep questions and pushing them into the future, but that future is becoming now. These amount to an existential crisis for the West. Declining birth rates, which are heavily correlated with declining religiosity, cripple a population by aging and removing youthful energy in more people. If the West can't wage offensive war and a majority of the West has no desire to fund any military, it's effectively tying its own hands behind its back against more brutal opponents like Russia and China. If every vector of Western culture hates the West, after a couple generations, no sense of cultural unity will be left. Legendary German historian Oswald Spengler once described Western civilization as Faustian, and that it traded an easy understanding of the world for looking for the truth and thus got an incredible amount of power. Nietzsche once said that you can judge a man by how much truth he can handle. The West looked for truth and probably saw more than was healthy for our society. It saw a world where there's no real evidence for God, where you can still get the barbarity of the trenches after centuries of improvement, where the only law that exists is cruel Darwinism and a single supernova could wipe out life in an instant. Western man, believing he was guided by God towards greater and greater glory, slunk back into depression in his lonely apartment and hated that he ever tried in the first place, hating only those who still had the courage to try even more. Everything is uncertain, but, in my opinion at least, the one thing that can keep the West alive and keep it going is faith. Not even faith in God, but faith in our own ability to exist and do good. Before we end, I have a final announcement. I'm a keynote speaker at Intelligent Speech, a digital conference this April 24th. Tickets and details in the description. Also, I'm starting a partnership with quiz company Takeoff where you can win real money for winning quizzes on trivia and what if altist videos starting in 2 weeks. Link again in the description. Also, if you like this video, you could check out my merch in the link in the description or visit my Patreon for the first 11 chapters of my history of the world, alongside the first 3 of my cultural history of America. There's also cool maps and fan-only videos. Well, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.